With Reagan's presidency, let's get to the 1980 election. Now, if you remember from the previous videos on Carter, Carter did not, in general, have the most succinct plan for how to fix the economy. That was one of the reasons why he did not have a majorly positive reputation by 1980. And then also his failed negotiations and failed rescue attempts with the Iran hostage crisis definitely gave him a bad reputation. So when Carter runs for re-election in 1980, he tries to stress the positive achievements that he made during his time in his first term in office. So he argues that the Camp David Accords were a significant foreign policy success. If you remember, that established peace between Egypt and Israel, and the president of Egypt recognized Israel as a state for the first time. And then another thing that Carter tries to do to warn people against voting for Reagan is he says, if you vote for Reagan, he's going to increasingly de-emphasize federal programs. He's going to shift more ideas to the states, so he warns against the dangers of federalism. And he also says that someone like Reagan is going to become more militaristic, increase defense spending, maybe sort of reignite some of the tensions during the Cold War. These warnings were true, but there were certain people that argued that there should be a little bit more military escalation because, if you remember, in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, so that did sort of reignite Cold War tensions. When Reagan ran for president, he, first off, is a good example of conservatives blaming a large, overly powerful government for some of the current problems in society. So he basically made the argument that government was too big. Government was the problem, not the solution. So it's one of the major reasons why we see a major wave of deregulation when Reagan is in power. But at the same time, we will see him increase defense spending. So we could kind of argue that there are some sort of inconsistencies in that. So he does argue for increased defense spending. Some of this, again, he's reacting against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And he also argues that he will balance the budget. And it's always something that people are a huge fan of, especially with the, given the days of stagflation, people were not necessarily seeing positive gains in their pocketbooks. So he argued that he'd make sizable cuts in government spending in order to balance the budget. And then even more importantly, he pointed to something he called the misery index. In other words, Reagan was fond of asking the question during his campaign, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? So in other words, he was trying to play upon whether people felt that their lives improved under Carter's administration. If they were to answer no to that question, then Reagan basically would argue that then people should vote for him. As far as the election outcome is concerned, it's not as big of a sweep as what we're going to see in 1984, but it's still a significant victory for Reagan. He gets about a little over 50% of the popular vote. There is an independent candidate that takes about 6, but he does not take any electoral votes. So you can see as far as the electoral victory is concerned, it's pretty major, right? So, in a lot of ways, Reagan sees this as a mandate to start to move the country in a more conservative direction. Republicans also gained control of the House and Senate during the 1980 election, and that's significant because that ends about a half of a century of Democratic dominance of Congress. So this is going to be another reason why the government turns in a more conservative direction. And again, like I was saying earlier, you're going to see some non-traditional people who are voting for Reagan. So, for example, you're going to see traditional Democratic voters like blue-collar white workers, for example, and more Southern voters starting to vote for Reagan. So that starts to show us that the Democratic Party is sort of fracturing after Carter. And also what we see is that by taking so much of the blue-collar vote, the New Deal coalition is sort of breaking apart. So basically what we're seeing is that there is an emergence of a new right. So in other words, we're going to start to see a new group of people that is rising to power, and they are sort of a political coalition, first of conservative evangelical Christians, right? So born-again Christians are going to increasingly emerge and identify with this growing conservative movement. A lot of them are going to call themselves the moral majority. This is a term that was originated by this man down here, the Reverend Jerry Falwell. He was a Baptist minister, and he founded Liberty University, which was it's still seen as one of the most conservative universities in the country. And the purpose of Liberty University was to restore Christian values in America. So basically, we're going to start to see a growing number of outspoken conservatives that start to emerge during this time. And again, they kind of feel the mandate because of Reagan's election. Again, you see a lot of Southern Democrats attaching themselves to the new right. Many of them call for the reduction of social programs. So, for example, they don't like the idea of welfare spending. You're going to see, again, an increasing move away from the Great Society programs of Lyndon Johnson. They want the government to shrink, federal government, that is. And they also feel that the American military should expand, and they also tend to argue that they are the most patriotic group. By the 1980s, again, we start to see that there is definitely a revolution more in the conservative direction. We could say that it already was underway when Nixon was elected president in 1968 and 1972, but because of the Watergate scandal, there is a little bit of a turn away from the Republican Party, at least temporarily, with Carter's election. But this is very brief. As we know, Carter only serves one term, and his presidency was marred by a series of unfortunate events like the Iran hostage crisis. And also, Carter was seen as sort of mishandling a lot of problems. For example, he didn't really have a clear policy to handle the problems with the economy, and also, as we know, he did not handle the Iran hostage crisis very well. Reagan, on the other hand, had a good reputation for communicating with his constituents. He was nicknamed the Great Communicator. Often he used folksy anecdotes in his speech that ordinary people could understand. And even though he was an older president, he was in his 70s when he was president, he was seen as very appealing, very accessible to younger American voters. Some people argue that the reason why he gained this reputation was because he was seen as a Washington outsider. As we know, he had this Hollywood career before he entered into politics, so people saw him as more accessible. When Reagan was inaugurated, he gave sort of a very inspiring inaugural speech. He wrote, "In the days ahead, I will propose removing the roadblocks that have slowed our economy and reduced productivity. Steps will be taken aimed at restoring the balance between various levels of government. Progress may be slow, measured in inches and feet, not miles, but we will progress. It is time to reawaken this industrial giant, to get government back within its means, and to lighten our punitive tax burdens. And these will be our first priorities, and on these principles there will be no compromise." So in other words, what we start to see is that he's trying to motivate a population that had been previously disillusioned by the inactions of Carter and Ford. He was trying to make the argument that he would work to bring jobs back to the United States that had been lost. And yeah, I mean, basically his argument was that maybe the progress would be incremental, but still at the same time, his argument was that he would make the priority to sort of bring the United States back to its economic prosperity, which made him quite popular. So how does he do this? His major economic policy we refer to as Reaganomics. So Reaganomics was basically a policy that advocated, first off, cutting the taxes, in particular for the wealthy. This economics system was also referred to as supply-side economics, basically making the argument that by returning money to the pockets of Americans, they would in turn increase spending, which would then stimulate the economy, right? So another thing that happened in addition to a tax cut was Reagan was a huge proponent of significant reductions in federal spending. And so basically he thought that by cutting federal spending and by cutting taxes, more people would go out and spend money. It would create new jobs. It would encourage people to invest more, and it would also stimulate industrial growth. And so the major indicator, or the major move that he makes to actually get his Reaganomics policy going is in 1981, he signs into law the greatest or largest tax cut in American history up until this point. It was the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981, and it was a 30% reduction in taxes, so a major, major tax cut. Like I was saying before, another major policy that went into Reaganomics was deregulation of the economy. So Carter actually did start some of this deregulation. Reagan continues it. So he cut spending on social and cultural programs. He cuts more than $40 billion from domestic programs such as food stamps, student loans, and mass transportation. And he also appoints conservatives to head a lot of executive agencies, so things like the EPA. And when conservatives head these agencies, they launch a wave of deregulation across these cabinets. So, for example, with putting conservatives in charge of the EPA, more public lands were opened up to development. Environmental regulations were eased, sometimes eliminated, and sometimes civil rights violations were also overlooked in other executive agencies. And so you might ask the question why deregulation was taking place. Well, one of the major tenets of conservatism was to get governments out of the way of the people. And so this deregulation was a way that they saw that happening. Another element of Reagan's attempt to sort of balance the budget was to try to shift a lot of policymaking by diverting funds from the federal government to states. All right, so this started under Nixon. Again, the idea was to limit the federal government and to place certain federal powers back in the hands of the states. So some of the ways he does this is he eliminates public service jobs, he reduces unemployment compensation, he lowers welfare benefits, and he raises fees for Medicare patients. So again, a lot of these are sort of Great Society programs that were initiated under Johnson that Reagan is going to work to get rid of. And also he flirts with the idea of abolishing sub-agencies altogether. So for example, he suggests abolishing the Department of Education, but he does not actually succeed in eliminating that agency altogether. And what we do see is that at first, despite his support of new federalism, some federal domestic spending grows for a few years, but ultimately we are going to see an increased shift towards deregulation overall. All right, so what's the impact of Reaganomics? Basically, one of the things we're going to see is that, first off, this idea of both cutting taxes and cutting federal spending does not really work. By the end of 1981, the country is facing a large recession. We're going to see major bankruptcies. We're going to see soaring unemployment. Unemployment is going to reach 11% by 1982. You're going to see a loss of tax revenues overall because of these tax cuts. And so a lot of people started to doubt the effectiveness of the tax cuts. So this cartoon here and this cartoon here demonstrate that. The idea that if there is a tax cut placed on the rich, could it truly trickle all the way down to the lowest classes? The idea was that, this tax cut ultimately would mainly be used up when it was still sort of only reaching the highest sectors of the economy. And by the time we reached the poor, there was very little left over. Other things. The government also is heavily borrowing from foreign investors to try to finance its growing debt. And so the U.S. basically becomes the leading debtor in the world. And if you remember, this is a significant shift from, let's say, the U.S. at the end of World War II, or World War I rather, where it was the largest creditor nation, right? So there's a huge shift there. So by 1982, we're going to see that Congress is actually going to change its mind and it's going to raise taxes again. 1982, the government passes the largest tax increase in American history to attempt to reverse the situation. So this shows us that there is a growing need for increasing revenues. By 1983, we're going to see the economy start to rebound, but again, upper incomes benefit the most. The middle class in general remains stagnant. In terms of the overall long-term impact of Reaganomics, first off, in general, we see a major trend in the direction of deregulation. We see more of a return to a free market economy. We're going to see in general that federal deficits are going to increase about $200 to $300 billion a year. And so because the federal deficit keeps increasing, even Democrats, when they return to power, are going to have trouble proposing new government programs because there's such a large deficit that there isn't any money to spend on it. And I couldn't help just by adding in this cartoon here. In general, there was a sense, again, of the limits of trickle-down economics, and this cartoon is kind of suggesting that this was sort of a joke among leading conservatives. Not necessarily supporting this cartoon, just sort of something that may help you remember trickle-down economics. All right, the last videos that we'll pick up next time looking at Reagan's foreign policy, and we will also look at the end of the Cold War. We'll look at some of the domestic events like the war on drugs, the AIDS epidemic, and then we will basically reflect upon Reagan's legacy. And then the last couple of videos that will come out later this week will be on George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. So stay tuned for those, and thanks.